All right, we are recording, and now I'm going to turn off my video, and I'll mute here in a second, and I'm going to let people. We're going to go live, and we're going to go live now, and this will bring all the attendees in. So here we go.
Our power has always been in ourselves, in our people.
Good morning and welcome to the 52nd Annual Pacific Northwest Labor History Association Conference. I am Tom Lux, I'm the president of PNLHA. This would be our 53rd, but we had to cancel the 2020 conference due to COVID-19. This conference will be totally virtual for the same pandemic reason. We hope to return to in-person conferences next year. Before I continue my remarks, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. And many of us join today from Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, Puyallup, as well as the tribes of the Muckleshoot, Tulalip, and other Coast Salish peoples and their descendants. Given the topic of today's discussion and the systemic and institutionalized oppression of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, we invite you to join us in the continued learning, decolonization, and acknowledgement of historical violence of unpaid labor on stolen land. No matter where you live, you are on Indigenous land, in many cases, shared or disputed territory of multiple tribes. I want to thank our partners who are helping us with the technology, the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Archives of Washington, both based at the University of Washington. I also thank our many co-sponsors who help get the word out about this conference. PNLHA was formed in 1968 by a group of labor leaders and activists who were disappointed that the local history conferences did not have a labor history component. Over the years, in addition to our labor history conferences, we have sponsored many local events such as steamership rides from Seattle to Everett, retracing the IWW voyage that ended in the Everett Massacre. We have commemorated the Centralia tragedy and the Seattle General Strike. We have participated in worker cultural events like Mayworks and other conferences and events in Washington and in Oregon and in British Columbia. Our members have written books and articles, participated in radio shows and social media, and documented oral histories. Ron Verzu recently published the booklet Working Oregon. PNLHA helped publish Lucy Ostrander's video on Anna Louise Strong, A Witness to Revolution. And just recently, David Jepson's excellent video, Labor Wars of the Northwest. PNLHA brings a history of struggle for labor and human rights to the forefront. For over 50 years, we have explored regional, national, and international issues and used music, drama, and reenactments, talks, and papers to highlight labor history. In this era of economic inequality and right-wing attacks, we need to remember the struggles of working people and their unions, because without this memory, we will not be able to make a better world. Our membership includes active trade unionists, university and college professors and students, and others inspired by the history of workers' struggles for rights, fairness, and social and economic justice. The association's activities are centered in, but not limited to, the region of Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. We invite you to join PNLHA. Details and a membership form can be found on our website, pnlha.org. I hope you enjoy our conference. And now I'd like to introduce April Sims, the Secretary Treasurer of Washington State Labor Council, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Good morning, sisters, brothers, and siblings. It's good to be in space with you all today. I have the privilege of introducing today's keynote speaker. Now, if you Google Bill Fletcher's name, any number of titles and accolades will pop up. He's an activist, a leader, a scholar, an author, a columnist, and a commentator. And the list goes on. But being from the East Coast, I know that Bill doesn't like long intros, so I won't bore you with information that you can find with a Google search. Instead, I will share this. Bill Fletcher is a self-described joiner. He joins and helps form and improve organizations and initiatives because he believes that the only weapon the oppressed really possess is organization. And that belief was on full display in 2016 when Bill joined the Washington State Labor Council and helped our organization begin our anti-racism initiative. I want you to know that we are forever grateful to Bill Fletcher for taking that initial flight west to Seattle and for all the additional flights he took in support of our work. We would not have the program we have today were it not for Bill and the fact that he is a joiner. So it is with much appreciation and love that I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, the one and only Bill Fletcher Jr. So please drop some love in the chat or hit him with some emojis. Either way, give it up for Bill Fletcher Jr. How you doing, Bill?
I'm doing great. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, April. It's the kind of introduction I appreciate. You often, one often goes to these conferences and the introductions are basically reading someone's CV. And you can find that elsewhere. But I appreciate the kind of introduction that you gave me very, very much. And I want to thank you. And I want to thank the Pacific Northwest Labor Association for inviting me to speak this morning with everyone. And I've been very, very much looking forward to this. Now, I know that the theme of the conference is all labor it's a respect for all labor. Forgive me, I'm drawing a blank, it's age. All labor has dignity. I'm taking a sort of different angle at that this morning in order to look at the moment that we're in. Because to a great extent, I'm frightened, while at the same time, I think that there are myriad possibilities for a new labor movement in this moment. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I want to speak with you about Trump, right-wing populism, and what our movement, particularly the labor movement, needs to consider in battling for democracy. And I would argue that that is the moment we're in, a fight for democracy and to extend democracy. Trump and his administration came to feel like a nightmare that resulted from consuming bad shellfish. The reaction of many liberals and progressives, however, tended to isolate the Trump phenomena from US history and treat it as exceptional. It was not and is not. Trump was a particular outcome of US history. We have a history rooted in settler colonialism, racial slavery, forced labor, and imperial expansion, but also a history rooted in class struggle and broader struggles for freedom. Within that context, the more or less official self-conceptualization of the United States was that of a white republic, which over time expanded to include other populations, but was to be at its core a white republic. The tug of war within the US over the extent to which it should be a democracy has led to titanic clashes of those who wish the country to remain or reestablish itself as the white republic, along with those who wish the continued domination by a plutocracy on the one hand, versus those who have sought time and again for an expansion of democracy and the winning of inclusiveness. The profound political and economic victories of the 20th century by progressive social movements, including but not limited to organized labor and the various freedom movements, started to change the texture of this country and challenge the racial oligarchic republic. It was inevitable that there would be a reaction or a pushback. The scope and form of such a pushback, however, was not inevitable. The reconstruction of the US political right began in the aftermath of the defeat of the Goldwater presidential campaign in 1964, and we have been living with the subsequent results. The so-called new right created a novel right-wing ecology within which institutions were built and social movements were bred. This counterattack mounted against the 20th century, which is the way that I conceptualize it, was at its heart an effort to restore in all its glory the racial oligarchic republic. And it is this linkage between the racial, gender, and economic that becomes so important in understanding this moment and as social forces arrayed against one another. It also helps us to understand the weaknesses contained within organized labor. The overall reactionary movement that emerged could be characterized as right-wing populist in that it was and is a racist, sexist, xenophobic, authoritarian, irrationalist movement and seeks the future in the past. The nationally specific character of this movement is what I would call neo-Confederate, in that the critical image for this movement is the Confederate States of America, though going forward it is probably taking particular lessons from apartheid South Africa. And as a side note, when I say nationally specific, it is to emphasize that right-wing populism is a global phenomenon, but that when you look at it, you have to understand the national particularities of right-wing populism, whether it's in France, Belgium, Norway, Britain, or Rwanda. This is an angry movement that is built on revenge for what has allegedly been taken from good, hardworking white Americans. It is fueled by resentment to the effect that the white republic has not come through, at least for the last few decades, with the promises that were made to whites. Trump spoke for this movement and as such revolutionized the Republican Party, taking the party by storm. Thus, Trump must be understood as not the cause of the movement or the generator of the movement, but rather the rattle on the tail of the rattlesnake, creating the noise in anticipation of the attack. The snake has been moving around in the US political system for decades, and particularly after the 1994 midterm elections and the so-called contract with America, the entire tenor of US politics altered dramatically. The amazing authoritarian turn that we have experienced was surprising only for those who do not appreciate US history. Whether in the defeat of Reconstruction, the wars against the indigenous, the 1898 Wilmington, North Carolina coup, the racial massacres from 1917 through 1921, Red Summer and the Red Scare, the expulsion of 500,000 to 2 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans, the imprisonment of Japanese Americans, and so on, authoritarianism has been part of the blood of the US political system. In fact, many people would argue that democracy only raised its head on these shores in 1965. Yet too many of us have lived in denial, and the us includes organized labor. So what transpired on January 6th? Simply put, it was a coup attempt. It was one segment of the political class led by Trump that wished to overturn the Constitution by derailing the vote count. All of the indicators had been there to alert us to the fact that Trump was just evil enough, maniacal enough to try this. And through his supporters, always with plausible deniability, a coup was constructed. A more competent, less narcissistic authoritarian might have been able to pull it off. I tend to think that he wanted to simply scare Congress and perhaps lay the foundation for a declaration of martial law. But the larger capitalist class was not ready for the termination of so-called democratic capitalism, and the political class was overwhelmingly against such a turn, despite the fact that large numbers of billionaires had supported the Trump presidency. This was not a white working class uprising, a point that I want to double emphasize. This was an uprising carried out by fascists and proto-fascists, overwhelmingly white, who have been trapped in a delusional bubble. In fact, working class members of the coup attempt were a clear minority. And this bubble has been reinforced through a combination of right-wing media, including Fox News, and right-wing social media. This is a movement that one could describe as the 21st century incarnation of the Flat Earth Society. What we saw displayed was both the reality of that the Republican Party is now the party for dictatorship. Let me emphasize that. It is no longer just a hard right-wing party. It is a party for dictatorship. And we've also witnessed the willingness of the far right to threaten various forms of military action in order to advance their agenda of restoring the racial oligarchic regime. What does this mean for organized labor? And what does this have to do with the notion that all labor has dignity? I want to focus on the notion of all labor, but with a specific take. The trade union movement has rarely thought of all labor. Born as an all-white phenomenon in the 1830s, it did not think of itself as a continuation of the bondservant revolts or the slave revolts of the 1600s or the 1700s. But instead, it saw itself as a movement of white workers within a white republic. After the Civil War, it was forced to confront the reality that all labor, that is, all the working class, was not white, but were akin to the streams flowing down the mountainside that converge into a mighty river. But organized labor really did not want to accept that reality. So for the bulk of organized labor, at least the official organized labor, some labor had dignity. The fight of the progressive segment of organized labor has been to reconceptualize the entire notion of a trade union movement into that of a 21st century labor movement. The narrowness with which organized labor has looked at its role and its tasks came to be summarized by the thinking of American Federation of Labor president and founder Samuel Gompers. That is pure and simple trade unionism or bread and butter trade unionism. This view narrowed the role of trade unionism to fighting for wages, hours, and working conditions. Contrary to Gompers, there were other movements whose banner could better draw from the words of A. Philip Randolph in saying that the essence of trade unionism is social uplift. The battle between these two tendencies has gone on through to this day. In the face of Trump and right-wing populism, the bulk of organized labor has largely been ineffective because it has wished to shy away from discussions of race, gender, and right-wing populism. It has wanted to believe that by convincing all workers, but especially white workers, that unity can come via a focus on economics, that it can avoid the thorny issues of a working class divided by race, ethnicity, gender, immigration status, and religion. The question then is whether the trade union movement can not only morph into a 21st century labor movement, but whether it can be a movement that at its core heralds the struggle for consistent democracy. It is with consistent democracy that we can defeat right-wing populism, irrespective of who the rattle happens to be. It is by extending the principles of democracy into all fields, the economic, the political, think about voting, the social, think about equality, a right to choose what to do with one's body, a life free of constant gender-based harassment. It was through that we can defeat the forces of evil and create a new majority that we need to lead the United States and to join with the rest of the world in saving humanity, saving the planet from one or another form of incineration. This means a hell of a lot more than a movement organized around overtime grievances or even opposing oppressive trade agreements. This means building a movement of all labor, a movement that is clear that real dignity is established when power relations shift. That is our task. That is our mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. As always, very thought-provoking. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A. If anyone else has questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them today. This one's from West Brain. Bill, how can we convince organized labor to step up and become a player in SP healthcare reform. There are a few examples. The nurses union jumps out, but for the most part, most organized labor is on the sidelines and not offering the leadership we need. Now is the time what to do.
That's a great question. There's different parts that I'll give to that in response. So one thing when it comes to healthcare reform is understanding that there are elements of our movement that have an institutional interest in the status quo. And we should be very honest about that. They have their health joint management labor health programs that employ people, have a lot of money, and they're interested in preserving those. So the reality is that we have to take those on. And I'll give you an example of the problem. Prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, there was a nasty dispute between Unite Here in Nevada and supporters of Bernie Sanders. And the Unite Here leadership in Nevada took the position that Medicare for All would in effect threaten the great health plan program that Unite Here had won over the years. And while I want to take nothing away from Unite Here, from its courage and particularly the role that they played in the 2020 election, I think that they missed the point that their health plan depended entirely on employers. And as we saw when we went through a mini depression in the face of the COVID pandemic, that when employers collapse, one of the problems that emerges is the impact on our healthcare programs. And that we therefore need a national program that is available whether someone is a union member or not, whether someone is enrolled in something or not. So at one level, we've got to take that on. Another thing that I think a way we can challenge this is by actively engaging the movement in the fight around the COVID pandemic right now. The Biden administration had anticipated that by July 4th, 70% of the population would have been vaccinated. And they've come close, but they're not going to make it. And partly because they didn't turn the whole fight around COVID into a real national movement, which I think that the organized labor could have participated in. And we could have done a grassroots effort talking to regular people about this plague and about the role of government. And the role of government in responding and being prepared for these sorts of plagues, and for making sure that the entire population, in this case, is vaccinated. So I think that there's a social movement element to this that has to happen. And I think that the third element that we have to be very conscious of, particularly because of other antics of the right wing, is red baiting. And that what the right has done, and segments of the Democratic Party, is to suggest that Medicare for all is socialism or communism, and that this is a horrific future for the United States, and that the market system is the way to go. And I think, frankly, we just simply have to take that on and point to the myriad systems out there that have relied on a full-blown national healthcare system and what that's meant for civilizing those respective countries.
Thank you, Bill. Excellent answer. We have a few. I'll read through these few, Bill, and if you want, and you can answer as you can.
Mm-hmm.
One from Kevin Allen is, how can we use this PNLHA to really utilize our specialty, history teaching, to offset the negativity, including anti-critical race theory, 1619, etc., especially to our membership, in particular our newer members. And we have one from Bob Rossi. Bill, I think that your point that labor has been inconsistent or in denial where labor having dignity is concerned. But two questions. How do we deal with this as automation rapidly increases? And is there a connection between increasing automation and Trump's populism and racism? And a third question by Michael Funk. Can you talk more about building communities of solidarity and the role that unions, the labor councils need to play in doing that, especially in small communities?
Okay, those are great questions. And I'm going to add a comment. Let me start with a comment, and it has to do with the challenge of facing organized labor as a whole and how unprepared we are. I had a discussion with some union leaders just the other day, and we were talking about labor education. And what I pointed out to them is that organized labor, by and large, had no strategy to prepare itself in case January 6th had succeeded. I mean, think about it for a second. Let's say that those fascists had succeeded in storming the Capitol and disrupting the vote and the vote count. What were we going to do? And for the most part, our movement had no answer because we weren't even asking the question. See, we need to understand we're standing in a very different moment. And we need to be asking questions that many people find pretty scary. But that's in part because this is a scary moment. And we need a leadership that's prepared to do that, which goes into Kevin's question. So, Kevin, I think that this discussion of history right now is so important. And that one of the things that the labor movement and groups like your association need to be doing is not engaging in a discussion about the pros and cons of critical race theory. It's about the pros and cons of the truth. And we should be very clear that the right wing that's attacking critical race theory, most of whom could probably never spell critical race theory, let alone explain what it actually is, they're not concerned about critical race theory. What they're doing is a version of the anti-communism of the 40s and 50s and 60s, which is to put a label on something you don't like in order to scare the bejeebies out of people so that people don't think, but they just simply react. And so our response needs to be that we're actually talking about the truth. And one of the ways to do this, there's a couple of different ways. Let me give you an example. So in Oklahoma, they passed a bill that you cannot teach anything that is going to make someone uncomfortable about their race or gender. As we would say in New York, what the hell does that mean, right? I mean, make someone uncomfortable. So does that mean that a teacher cannot teach about the Armenian genocide if there's someone of Turkish origin in the class who says, ooh, that makes me uncomfortable? Does that mean that a teacher can't teach about the Holocaust against the Jews if there's someone of German extraction who says, ooh, you're making me feel bad? And obviously that means you can't talk about slavery because that's going to make a lot of white people say, ooh, I feel bad. I mean, it's absurd. And so I think that we have to challenge the absurdity of this. And I think that we also have to give support to educators who want to teach the truth. And a suggestion I made to a friend the other day is that we should begin producing virtual freedom schools and the relevant curriculum that's made available to educators around the country that helps them teach the truth. And we should be completely unapologetic about that. And we should engage in battles with the right wing in the various media about the truth. I mean, you know, one of the thing about history is this. History is a combination of facts plus interpretation. Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Fact. There is that he wasn't defeated at the Battle of Youngstown or the Battle of Paris or the Battle of Naples. He was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Now, the question of why he was defeated there is a matter of interpretation. And that's one of the things I love about history. And so you interpret based on a collection of facts, the preponderance of facts, not the preponderance of opinions. And so I think it's really important for us to take people on, and your association can play a critical role there. To the question of automation, I would say that what Trump and the right-wing populists are responding to is a combination of the restructuring of global capitalism, including issues of automation, but also the relocation of industry, as well as changing demographics. So you have a situation, and this is true not just in the United States, you can see this in Europe, where the relocation of industry, the relocation out of major cities of big industry, as well as the introduction of new technologies, has changed the working class in the global north. And so you have industries that have moved into more rural areas, industries that have downsized, et cetera. And this has had a demonstrable impact on people's living standard. Disproportionately, I might add, African Americans and Chicanos and Puerto Ricans. Now, I say that because there are people in the labor movement that try to drive a one-to-one correspondence between the changing economy and support for Trump. But if it was the changing economy by itself, then African Americans and Latinos in majorities would have been supporting Trump. But that didn't happen. Therein, you have to add changing demographics. And what I was talking about before about this threat to the idea of the white republic, which plays itself out in terms of, well, it was summarized by the fascists that marched in Charlottesville that said, Jews will not replace us and we will not be replaced. It's this fear of white replacement combined with the issue of the economy that has encouraged Trump's base. So it's a number of these different things together. And in terms of communities of solidarity, this is in many ways a task of our central labor councils and our state federations. When I talked in my speech about going from being a trade union movement to a labor movement, I'm saying that we need to be a movement of the working class and not just of our affiliates, right? Not just of our institutions that have collective bargaining. So we need to be a movement that is speaking to how workers are getting stomped on around this country. And we need to be responding as such, whether those workers are immigrants or not, whether those immigrants are white or of color. And so we need to have a movement that is focused on social justice, because a movement focused on social justice can bring about issues of solidarity. In the absence of linking that fight around solidarity to social justice, you'll get a movement that will pose the question moralistically, but not programmatically.
Thank you, Bill. We have 3 more questions. I'll lump them together again, if that's all right.
Sure.
One from Earl Peach, curious about how the labor movement can respond to the unequal distribution of vaccines around the world. How can we establish solidarity with the billions who remain defenseless against COVID? Then Brian Charlton asked, Americans and by extension, the American labor movement can sometimes be insular. What role can international solidarity in helping move forward toward an egalitarian society? We have another one from West Brain. There has been a move within organized labor to consolidate and run it top down. This is a killer. SEIU and Andy Stern are one example. And even here, within our labor councils in Oregon, we have another. 2/3 of budgets were stolen from local control and run top down. I love our labor movement and hate to see this self-destruction. What can we do, Bill? And one last one here from Brent McFarlane. Question from Barbara Finney. There's a right-wing recall attempt against socialist Seattle City Council member Shama Sawant, dividing labor. Can you speak to this?
Oh, great questions. So let me take them in order. Labor responding to the unequal distribution of vaccines around the world. This is directly related to the question, second question about international solidarity, that in our movement, we have very little international solidarity. To a great extent, it exists on a transactional basis. And this is at least in part due to a very limited education of our members and the fact that we exist within the heart of an empire. And it's easy when you're in the heart of an empire to not think about the rest of the world. So in terms of responding to the unequal distribution, this is a political question. And it necessitates, I would think, central labor councils and state feds particularly taking the lead in putting pressure on our elected representatives in Congress around this and making that argument. I think otherwise it's simply not going to happen. There will be some national unions that will respond favorably, but I think that this is a collective project of the labor movement, or at least it should be. And we need to take this up and go beyond organized labor, in fact, to other social justice organizations. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that the second question is correct, as I said earlier, about the lack of international solidarity. So what do we need to do about that? In addition to internal education, one of the things that we need to be thinking about is at the level of strategy, how do we take on both multinational corporations, but also how do we engage in support work with labor movements that are under high degrees of repression? For example, right now in Myanmar, after the coup, what do we do? The Myanmar workers desperately need assistance. They need money, they need international pressure. So we need a national campaign, and we have elements of it. APALA has taken a lead, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance has taken a lead in this, but we need more than APALA in raising resources that can be brought to bear to support that movement. We also need to be thinking about how to undermine the junta in Myanmar, and how to think about that at the very much like we would do in a contract campaign. What's the soft underbelly of the Myanmar military, and what can labor do about that? So we need to be operating on multiple levels, but this really necessitates building up support within our ranks, because if we don't have members that believe in this, the problem is that this can all evaporate. And that's part of the problem that we're seeing in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder last year, when a number of unions passed very good resolutions in support of Black Lives Matter and calling for police reform, but they hadn't conducted internal education. And there have been right-wing backlashes that the leaderships have been unprepared to address. The question about consolidation, this is complicated, is in part because one of the things that has to be looked at is whether an institution has sufficient resources in order to carry out its job. So for example, if you have a local union or a central labor council that has no resources, is completely volunteer, the question is, do they have the capacity to do their work? And I distinguish that from what went on in SEIU that began when I left SEIU in '96, shortly after Andy Stern took over, where there was this obsession on within Andy's leadership of bigger is better, and thinking that all you had to do was to consolidate unions and that built power. But the problem was for Andy and many of his allies, building power was not really the power of workers, it was bargaining power. Because you can sometimes build an organization that is so big that regular people are never able to participate in the full debates and democracy because the union is just, it's just at a scale that's inconceivable for the rank and file. So I think you have to make that distinction. There are a lot of central labor councils, for example, around the country that are completely dysfunctional. They simply don't have the resources. So the question is, what do we do about it? And to the final question about a recall, in general, I'm very wary of recalls, but I particularly find it very curious that there could be any split within organized labor around Sawant and in terms of a recall. I don't agree with her on many things, but she is certainly progressive and is a pro-labor elected leader. And I think we have to be very careful about these recalls, which have been used more often than not by right-wingers in order to destabilize the political environment. At the level of principle, do I believe in recalls? Absolutely. But what I've seen more often than not, as we're seeing in California with the recall effort against Newsom, is that this is a way, a very effective way, by the way, for the right wing to try to destabilize liberal and progressive forces. And I think we have to be very wary of that.
We have a couple more questions here, Bill,
Okay.
from Amy Hagopian. Would Bill speak to the longshoreman effort to block the Israeli ZIM vote in Oakland and Seattle, and the solidarity built between local communities and labor in the process? And what to do about the Democratic Party officials who urged the longshoremen to just unload the boat? And that's followed by Marion Pollock. This is great. I have the following questions. One, in Canada recently, we have been made aware, yet once again, of the appalling treatment, exclusion, and genocide of Indigenous peoples. How do you see the labor movement addressing this in a way that is real and not performative? And two, when you talk about the labor movement, it's not only segmented by race, but by gender and sexual orientation. How would you address this?
Okay. So in my presentation, I did say a couple of times that the division is not just on race. And so I just wanted to highlight that perhaps the person, they may have missed it. I think that the general answer to the second question, or the second part of the second question, is that we need a different kind of trade unionism. I call it social justice unionism. And that's as opposed to the so-called bread and butter trade unionism of Gompers. We need a trade unionism that, that directly tackles the so-called divisive issues, such as race and gender. And that means, as I've tried to emphasize, that there has to be internal education within our ranks, because our members are all over the place when it comes to matters of race and gender. Even people who are racially oppressed, even people who are sexually oppressed, will often in a trade union environment shy away from suggesting that that is the job of the union, to take those on. And I think that we need a leadership that is prepared to do that. And so that includes both education, but also it includes taking on struggles that challenge forms of race and gender discrimination. For example, in terms of hiring practices by employers, taking on housing segregation and the implications, takes on promotional and disciplinary policies, that the leadership needs to constantly emphasize how these are in fact divisive, that the working class is already divided, and therefore our job is to unite it. And you unite it by taking on these so-called divisive issues, not by ignoring them. And the issue of the indigenous, whether it's in the United States or Canada, goes, one of the things when I have emphasized this notion of the white republic, this is one of the hardest issues for us in the trade union movement to tackle, that you have a movement that emerged and saw its identification with the settler state and saw the indigenous as an obstacle to development. And you've had a movement that has largely ignored the entire question of the indigenous, actually until quite recently. So what does this mean? Well, one of the things that this means is that we need to be at the forefront of supporting the treaties. In the period from, I think it was 1783 till the early 1880s, the United States signed somewhere well above 300 treaties with the indigenous nations and broke all of them, I believe. And so we still have these treaties that are on the books, and we've got to really be the defenders of those treaties. Now, this becomes very complicated for some unions that are very upset when there is a indigenous territory, so-called reservation, where there are, for instance, gambling casinos and other forms of economics that may not go along with trade unions. And I think what we've got to be approaching, the way we've got to be approaching this is, how do we unite with the workers in the indigenous areas? How do we support them? But how do we recognize and respect the tribal sovereignty? And so it becomes a political question of, first and foremost, the respect of these treaties, as opposed to the constant violations of these treaties. And this is going to be very, very difficult, particularly in rural areas where many of our members think that the land is their land, as opposed to that it was the land of the indigenous. Or you see in Oregon or in Washington, where these right-wingers have made, land claims, completely ignoring the claims of the indigenous. The question of the ILWU and the boycott of the Israeli shipping. This is a very, very big question. I don't have time to do justice to this, because it begins with a need to understand what has happened in Palestine and now Israel-Palestine since the 1800s. So to the very specific question, I think it's wonderful that the ILW local is calling for a boycott of the ship and unloading and not unloading the cargo. I think that's absolutely right. Within the Democratic Party, there is a major debate on the entire question of Israel and Palestine. And so it's not surprising that there would be representatives of the Democratic Party that are taking a different view. There are people in the Democratic Party who are on all sides of this issue. What I would strongly encourage is to read and study the history of the region, to understand that there were people that were there in the 1800s. They were in an area that was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. They were Arabs. They were known over time as Palestinians. That there were settlers that came from Europe, that settled there, largely from Europe. And that over time, their objective was to displace the Arabs and to create a separate state for the settlers. That is at the heart of this battle. And that while there can be arguments of who was there 2,000 years ago, what we do know is that the people that were there in the 19th century were genetically the descendants of the people who were there 2,000 years ago. We know this scientifically. And we know that there were people there in the 19th century who had a long history, who in many cases welcomed the settlers as long as the settlers were not going to displace them. And if this sounds familiar, this may sound a lot like what happened in North America in the 1600s when European settlers arrived. And so this is a very, very complicated question that necessitates people study it and study it carefully. And if we had more time, I would love to take many more questions about that, but I believe that I'm out of time.
Unfortunately, you're right. We are out of time. Boy, we can't explain enough that this has been great with your talk, Bill. As always, we love having you here.
Thank you.
Let's give Bill a round of applause or thumbs up or whatever you got.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Okay, take care.
You too. Okay, now, Connor.
Thanks a lot. Welcome, everybody. We're going to now have a panel on the essential voices of frontline workers. We're lucky to have several folks that have joined us who will speak to that. What we're going to do to try to save time is we're going to have the speakers actually introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what their position is within their organization and a little bit of their positionality within the events. I'm going to just do a brief intro and then turn it over and start with question prompts. COVID-19 has changed our work life in dramatic ways, blurring distinctions between home and work, casting low-wage workers on the front lines as essential without attendant safety measures, and forcing women out of the workforce in record numbers. Though the pandemic is often described as unprecedented, there is a great deal of continuity in the workers who are most harmed by it, with those who are most negatively impacted in hard times, women and workers of color. COVID-19 has highlighted existing racial and gender disparities in pay, access to healthcare, and stable jobs. Labor unions have been on the forefront of the efforts to protect worker rights during the pandemic, advocating for health and safety measures and hazard pay. 2020 was a year of crisis and transformation. At the same time, we faced a public health crisis, an economic disaster, racial tension at a breaking point and a resulting civil rights moment, and a crisis in our democracy. All of these co-occurring events fed one another. Every social institution in our communities, our nation, our economy, our families were in upheaval simultaneously. The advent of a vaccine and its wide distribution Despite the advent of a wide vaccine and its somewhat wide distribution, we are still feeling the aftershocks from that wave of pandemic and the possibility of future waves and their impacts. Now is a time to assess what has happened and talk about what we might envision for the future. Today we will focus on what has been going on in the world of workers in the Pacific Northwest, their experiences and their responses to the pandemic, their organizing, advocacy, and policy wins. We will try to view all of these within a regional historical context. So with that, I will introduce Jane Hopkins. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jane Hopkins. I'm the Executive Vice President of SEIU 1199 at Northwest. We are a union with healthcare workers, 30,000 of us, and worked mainly in hospitals. Obviously, everybody knows that this pandemic, healthcare workers were right in the forefront. So for my union, I was the point person that worked on everything that was to do with COVID. And then I was actually immediately after the first case that came to Washington State, that we had the first case of COVID, that I was called by the governor and asked to be on his advisory committee and his task force to work on what we needed to do to make sure that we keep Washingtonians safe. And luckily enough, I was also asked in November after the elections to be on the Biden-Harris transition, COVID transition team as well. So I have been really bringing the voices and the faces of the healthcare workers to every room in the policy space, and I have been, and also bringing the scope of being a woman, a Black woman, and an immigrant into that space as well. So I've been very lucky to be a part of this policy, but also really been very lucky to have our members, our workers, really having a voice in this pandemic. More than ever, they've been the ones that have been able to keep the country safe. And so I'm very, very lucky to have been a part of this process. So thanks very much for having me on today.
Thank you for being here. Next is Martha Elena Sonato.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Marta Sonato, and I'm the political director at PECUN, Oregon's Farm Worker Union, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. So at PECUN, we represent farm workers and working Latinx families all across the state. And as it's no surprise, right, farm workers are essential workers as well. And here in Oregon, the Latinx community has actually been also the hardest hit by COVID. And therefore, and in terms of workplaces, we also saw that the ag industry was one of the hardest hit. And so we've been actually seeing what we already knew were disproportionate impacts that our communities were feeling were even more magnified by COVID. And so we have really been on the front lines here in terms of making sure that farm workers have access to just general PPE, but also making sure that we're advocating for folks at the state level with policy making and also agency rulemaking, as a lot of that has happened to make sure that farm workers are protected, as there's been just a lot of history of farm workers always being left behind. And so I want to make sure that, we're in those spaces advocating for our communities all across Oregon, and specifically those that have been intentionally excluded for so long, as farm workers have. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for being here. Next, we have Melody Gramley from Ufcw 555.
Good morning. Hi, thank you for having me on here. My name's Melody Gramley. I am a union steward and a executive board member with Ufcw. I'm also an employee for Fred Meyer. Been with them for 25 years, going on 25 years, excuse me. We've experienced a lot of things with the pandemic, as far as myself and coworkers with customers coming in, and so it's important that we help each other, and we're trying to get some hazard funds for the frontline workers. We've been working on it since the pandemic has started, with making sure that employees have the needed PPE to protect themselves. Yeah, so along with doing legislative work, trying to help the frontline workers. So thank you for having me on here. A little nervous.
Thanks, Melody. You're doing great. Next, we have Andrea Torres from Unite Here Local 8.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Andrea Torres. I'm lucky to be here this morning with all of you. I am a 15-year Unite Here member. I currently had worked in the Boeing cafeteria. Right now, I am currently full-time organizing with Unite Here Local 8. I did have the pleasure this year of being able to attend the Go Out to Vote with the Biden-Harris campaign. So I did do the campaigning in Reno for 3 months and the state Senate runoffs for 2 months in Georgia as well. It was a great pleasure to be able to experience that and to be able to win the 6 months of healthcare for a lot of our coworkers who were hit hard in the hospitality industry with losing healthcare and not being employed at the time. So it is a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you again for having me, and look forward to some of the questions and answers.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. And next we have Joey Hartman, who also is a longtime PNLHA officer, as well as a leader in British Columbia labor history and the labor movement in British Columbia.
Yes, thank you. What a great panel. It's such a privilege to be part of this group. My name is Joey Hartman, and I'm joining you today from the British Columbia unceded and traditional territories of the Tarslet people. And my vantage point is that I'm the current chair of the BC Labour Heritage Centre and the past president of the Vancouver and District Labour Council, which is the Canadian version of Vancouver. And I also served as a staff person for 20 years with the Hospital Employees Union, representing healthcare workers across British Columbia. The closest thing that I would say in terms of the work I've been doing has been with regard to the Labour Heritage Centre, had a project called the Coveted Chronicles, where we collected history in the making with regard to the impact of COVID, where we did oral interviews, videotaped, and collected swag and all sorts of other what will become the materials of history in the future, and that interviewed essential workers as well as union leaders and other people who had direct stories to tell about the impact of COVID on their members, how they worked, and the economic situation as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Joey. It's just an honor to have you all here today. What a powerhouse of speakers. I wanted to start out with questions for Melody and Andrea, since you had a similar experience in terms of shop floor experience. And then I would say I'll try to address questions to folks, but I think that would probably be a lot more interesting if there's a conversation within the panel too. So I'll try not to guide it too much beyond that. But Melody, you've been a Fred Meyer employee for 25 years, and you're a union steward and vice president for Ufcw 555. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your experience as a worker and union officer during this time, like some of your impressions of the pandemic. And you mentioned some of the issues. I was wondering how the issues that you experienced in your day-to-day work kind of manifested also in the larger policy work by the union.
So, excuse me. So when the pandemic first started, myself, along with coworkers, we didn't have the PPE that we needed to protect ourselves when customers were coming in. Some of the customers were very, what's the proper word I want to use? They were very belligerent with the way they were acting towards us. So we've had employees that have been yelled at by the customers, or they've been spat on by the customers. There was nothing really set in place for us to protect ourselves against people coming in that had been exposed to the virus, or who had the virus, or just didn't want to or just wanted to ignore the mandates that had been put in place here in Oregon for everyone's protection. And so we have, our local has been working really hard to try and protect its members, and in the state of Oregon with getting PPE, working with OSHA to better restrict some of the things that have been happening here in Oregon. We have also tried to do a preemptive workman's comp in case our members contracted the virus, which we actually had quite a few of our members get it, with no success on that one through legislation. We have also, the state of Oregon has money that was allotted to them for the frontline workers, and we have been battling trying to get that money out to our frontline workers, and we're struggling with that.
Thank you
I
for
hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Andrea, I was wondering if you have sort of a unique position in that at the start of the pandemic, you were working on the shop floor at the Boeing Cafe, and then when that closed, you transitioned into a Unite Here organizing position. And I'm wondering, given that Unite Here's organizing efforts probably swung the Nevada and Georgia elections, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experiences both from that cafe job and also what it was like at the start of the pandemic to be in that job, and then transitioning to that Get Out the Vote effort in Nevada.
Yes. So I am a chef in the Boeing kitchen. And at first, when the pandemic hit, it was pretty scary for a lot of us there, as I work with a lot of elderly women there. And we were scared to be able to catch it because we work with a lot of international travelers who come to buy the planes. So, and it was a little scary because both of my children are also asthmatic. So I at times take care of my elderly grandma. So I was scared to bring the virus home, along with everybody there at work as well. At time too, my sister is a healthcare worker, and she works in the healthcare business. And for a while there, she wasn't sleeping at home to protect her 7 kids as well. And as we know, our Unite healthcare workers are the workers that clean those quarantine rooms as well in those hotels, and have been fighting against work overloads. So we had fought for a while to make sure that we were having our PPE protective equipment, that we were having cleaning schedules, that we were making sure that we were being safe and having the needs that we needed. And then our cafe, like I said, closed for a little bit. And so then I worked full time on the Biden-Harris campaign in Georgia. That was a really, really life-changing experience for me, as working 15 years at Boeing, I had never flown before. So it was kind of scary for my first time flying, but also it was encouraging because I have a 21-year-old daughter who was encouraging me to take this chance. She said, I know you're a single mom and I know you're scared to leave me. She's like, but if you pass this opportunity up, you're going to regret it, Mom. So I was very encouraged by her to also take the opportunity to be able to go and be a part of this action, which was amazing. And the fact that we won healthcare for a lot of our members who lost it and really rely on it dependingly solely every day was really heartfelt for me. And I think that we should all be proud that our union had won that opportunity for all of us.
Thank you. These next couple questions are for Jane and Marta, and it's sort of looking at the intersection between on the ground events and policy and advocacy and legislation strategies. So Jane, you were appointed to the Biden-Harris transition team's COVID advisory board. You're also on Governor Inslee's COVID task force, and I wonder if you could talk about how you conveyed some of the experiences of your members, what they were experiencing on the front lines as part of that task force, how you conveyed those concerns to the policymakers and lawmakers, and also your experience as the 1199 point person for COVID and public sector bargaining. Thanks.
I am muted. What First of all, I know that a lot of people, there's a lot of people that could have been in these spaces, and I am completely honored to have been representing all workers, right? So first of all, yes, when I was in that room, I had the experiences of 1199 members, but I was always thinking about all the workers that were putting their lives at risk every day, that they were worried about going home and either themselves having COVID or giving it to their families and being the reason why their family would die from COVID. Those experiences were so important to me. And also, at the beginning, what was really frustrating is we had known that this virus was around and that was going to come to the United States, that we were going to need PPE. So I felt that a lot of the employers already knew this, and they knew that there was not going to be enough PPE to go around. So they were already ahead of us, ahead of our workers, ahead of labor, going to the government, going to legislators, going to the CDC and saying, hey, maybe we need to reduce the guidelines here so that we don't have to look like we don't have enough PPE. So that was the first space that I got into. When we realized as labor that really employers had been ahead of us. And so a lot of the guidance that we had in CDC all of a sudden changed. The important guidelines that was going to protect workers and OSHA, that was going to protect OSHA's, were like completely diminished. So we had to fight that. That was the first thing we had to do, right? Making sure that everybody had enough PPE and that we had a way to produce more PPE. So that was a huge deal for our workers every day. So, I mean, I can make a whole list of all the things I heard from workers that we needed to bring to this, or to the policy, whether it was unemployment, whether it was PPE, whether it was making sure that high-risk workers were protected, whether it was, when people get sick from COVID, that they get to stay home and not worry that they're not going to have a full paycheck. All those things were brought, I had heard from workers and the experiences. So when I was in those rooms, although there was a lot of policy people, there was a lot of scientists, but I knew that without the workers' voice in that room, that we wouldn't have had the protections that we've got and we continue to fight for. So although a part of me was a little nervous, but it wasn't about me. This was about the workers and making sure that people were safe. And I was just so lucky to have been a part of that, to have been maybe able to, with workers, standing together with them to get protection for them. So I was just happy to be there.
Thank you. Marta, as the political director of PCUN, you've also were just recently in legislative session, and that's a key part of your work. You mentioned some of the issues that PCUN members are facing, as well as farm workers in general. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those events kind of led to some of your legislative strategy and just some of the things that they've been experiencing, especially in light of the precarity of farm workers generally, as you noted, and in relation to the pandemic.
Yeah, definitely. We actually just finished legislative session and it's been very grueling, I'd like to say. A grueling last couple of 6 months, very intense. And it was a virtual session as well, so it was definitely different. But I think the dynamics that we saw this year, they just tend to be different each year. And I definitely think that there's a lot of great things that have passed and some things that the legislature really fell short on. So I wanted to take a step back and just talk a little bit more about when COVID hit back in, more than a year ago, right? We knew that, our communities were going to be the most impacted because they have, always been intentionally left out of programs and just supports, investments. And so back in, when the pandemic started, 3 organizations got together, so PCUN, Causa, and Latino Network, and we basically got together over the weekend and try to figure out a way or to put a program forward that would make sure to provide financial supports to families that are undocumented, because we knew that they were just not going to get any sort of supports. And so over the weekend, we basically developed the Oregon Worker Relief Fund that would provide direct financial support to families or to individuals that are undocumented and who aren't able to access any sorts of stimulus payments or packages. And we continued on to more than 100 organizations joined our efforts. And we went through this, advocacy work, lobbying work, where we ended up securing our first $10 million through the legislature. And we were able to put up the, the Oregon Worker Relief Fund. And ever since then, we've been going back to the special sessions and just generally the legislature to make sure that they are investing in the Oregon Worker Relief Fund, and have to date actually sent out about more than $60 million out the door to workers, to undocumented workers. And I think one of the things that we also wanted to make sure that was part of this program was to set up a quarantine fund, because I was talking earlier, there's a lot of, here in Oregon, the ag industry was pretty hit by COVID, which means that farm workers were, disproportionately impacted. And so we set up this quarantine fund for specifically agricultural workers, so that they could access that if they came into contact with someone that had COVID or had COVID themselves and they needed to quarantine, to actually have a program they could apply to and not lose income. So that was another thing that we were working on. I think in terms of more of the recent legislative work, as I was saying, I think that workplace issues and abuses have definitely come to the front line. We knew they were always there, and we know that there's bad employers out there. And what we've seen is that through the pandemic, they became even more highlighted and were more emphasized. For example, I have a story from Manuel Nieve, who was really involved with us in the legislative session, sharing his story with us. But Manuel worked at a hazelnut farm with a couple of other workers, and this was last year, by the way. And they were working in really hot weather, and those of us that are in Oregon can probably relate right now because it's really hot. But they were working in really hot weather, and they continuously asked their employer for water. Hey, we need to drink some water, and the employer would not bring them water. And finally, after they asked the employer several times, they got 1 cup of water to be shared among all of the workers that were there. And so they didn't want to work. They didn't want to drink from that because of COVID concerns, and they ended up speaking out against that, and they ended up getting fired from the hazelnut farm. And so we know that workplace abuses continue to happen, and unfortunately the labor and we know that there's a lot of labor laws here in Oregon that protect workers, but many employers don't follow the law and don't make sure that their workers are protected. And so that's why in this session we introduced we called it the Just Enforcement Action, very similar to the PAGA legislation in California, where basically the worker steps into the role of the state and is able to sue the employer on behalf of the state. And they're also able to do that with a lot of support from nonprofit organizations or organizations that work with workers. So we really see the Just Enforcement Act as a long-term, as building power for workers and giving them more power than what they currently have, because it's really unbalanced at the moment. The reception that it's interesting because in the legislature, a lot of legislators have been talking about essential workers and about how their communities have been impacted. But what I really saw in the session was a disconnect between values, or what they say their values are, and their actions, because they were unwilling to support, I think, what were critical protections for workers. Like, for example, the Just Enforcement Act would have would have given workers more power to enforce their rights. It's just about enforcement, and we know that our agencies are falling short there. So our workers are, at least we've heard plenty from farm workers, they are so disillusioned by Oregon OSHA, by bully, because they're just like, they're never going to do anything for us and they don't protect us, right? And so they're like, okay, we want to give you more power, but the legislators don't want to work on this thing. So that was something interesting about that. And we know that just enforcement action is probably going to take a little bit more legislative sessions to get it through, but I thought that was very interesting. I think another example of that is with Farmworker Overtime. This was the first year that our organization brought forth Farmworker Overtime in the legislature. And Farmworker Overtime, so in 1938, farm workers were intentionally excluded because of their race, because the majority of farm workers were Black. And white farmers didn't want to pay them equally and fairly for their work. So they were intentionally excluded, and that exclusion still continues today. And we brought that forth, we're like, okay, in the pandemic of the century, where farm workers have always shown up to work and have been there for us and have been, feeding our families, keeping our economy running, let's make sure that they're paid equally and fairly for their work. They're already earning, low wages, and according to national studies, they earn about $20,000 to $25,000 a year, which I also got some legislators that they didn't believe me on that, but there are national studies on that. And so we're like, let's make sure that they get paid equally and fairly, especially when you're in harvest season and you're working many hours and it's hot, and you've already been impacted like in so many different ways and deep ways by the pandemic, and like other workers, you should be paid 1.5 times after 40 hours, right? And I think we made really significant headway. Both of our neighboring states, Washington recently passed their overtime, which was for farm workers, which is really exciting. And California has had overtime for a couple years now, but we made significant headway. But we also came across opposition from, or just more, wasn't vocal opposition from certain legislators, but definitely, some apprehensiveness there. And I thought that was just unacceptable, right? Because in the pandemic of the century, once again, when we talk about essential workers and farm workers being one of them, we have this very tangible policy, very straightforward, that you can do to make their lives a little bit better, pass it, and they were unwilling to do so. So I think that was very frustrating for us, but we'll continue moving forward. And I think that here we have a lot of success stories too, with the Oregon Worker Relief Fund and making sure that folks have access to financial assistance. And we've also been, I might be going over time, but we are also have been working through rulemaking processes with Oregon OSHA to make sure that workers are protected, like in terms of infectious diseases rules in the workplace, in terms of ag rules for farm workers, making sure that they have everything they need when they're working out in the fields. And currently, one of my colleagues is working on heat and stress rulemaking with Oregon OSHA as well, which now that wildfire season is coming, it's very, very important to be also working on that. So that's just a little bit about, the work that we've been doing. And I think, like I said, lots of good wins this session and unfinished business as well for next year.
Thank you, Marta. I really appreciate how you grounded that in history in the context of the larger, history of farm workers and current struggles. This next question is for Joey. Joey, you have this great positionality in that you have a awareness and a familiarity with labor history, and you're also a labor leader. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the themes that we've heard have been a continuity between trends over time that this pandemic has played out, but also a disruption. And I wonder if you can kind of reflect on our regional labor history in relation to that.
Yeah, happy to. So, Martha just talked about this is the pandemic of the century. And when we look historically, the most striking parallel has to be the so-called Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919. And I say so-called Spanish flu because it's almost certainly originated in Haskell County, Kansas. So if you wanted to name it by a origin, then I guess you'd have to call it the American flu. But it was huge. There was a third of the global population were infected by this flu in 1918, 1919. And that was 500 million people. And there was approximately 50 million people who died as a result of that flu. The United States statistic around that was 675,000 deaths. And we're talking 100 years ago. You can just imagine what that was like. And I think that if you want to look for some of the parallels to what's happening today, the responses for public health measures were very similar to what we're seeing today. The people were wearing masks. There was an anti-masking campaign and there was a pro-mask campaign. There was cancellation of large events, but by contrast, business continued to operate and maintain that they needed to keep the economy going. So people were allowed to gather in businesses, and yet things like union meetings and gatherings of workers were shut down. In Winnipeg, for example, the elite, who were very, very powerful capitalist movement in the city of Winnipeg, saw that as a huge advantage to have the ban on workers' meetings. But the unions, and this is probably a dangerous thing to do. Sorry, I've just got a ferry here outside my window. The union workers just met outside the city boundary. So they did have their mass gatherings, and probably that was not the smartest thing in terms of preventing the disease. They also really thought that, certainly in Canada, it was the return of soldiers and the mass gatherings to welcome them back from the First World War that were blamed for a lot of the sense that the disease had managed to spread far and wide in that context. And I think too, another really important parallel is that the COVID, the pandemic in 1918-19 and the one we're currently experiencing have really exposed the huge gaps of wealth, the inequity, and in fact have widened the divide in alarming ways. And I think too, the context of the 100 years ago is also important to think about how much social turmoil was happening at the time, and how that led to, in fact, some pretty significant changes afterwards. But, you know, World War I was just ending. There was a sense that these soldiers had gone off to fight the good war, the war that was going to end all wars. And in fact, the horrors of World War I were just beyond belief. And so many of those soldiers came back with what they then called shell shock, but was in fact what we would now call PTSD. And they really understood that it was young men, particularly with no other alternative but to go to war, and how they became the cannon fodder of the elite at the time. And it also then led to the 1919 Seattle general strike and the Winnipeg general strike and massive other support or solidarity strikes across the countries, both countries. And so you think about where are we now, and a convergence of different things happening. You know, it's happening in Canada as well as the US when you think about how these situations can either have an effect of what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine, where we are sort of paralyzed by how awful things are, and the elite and the capitalism grab that moment and manage to further advance their agenda in the worst ways possible? Or is this an opportunity perhaps for us to reactivate political and social activism in a way that brings together some of the mass movements that we've seen in recent years? So I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, which is in Canada, an Indigenous rights movement. We've just had some exposure of some mass graves in Canada, 215 children in a residential school in Kamloops, and over 700 just discovered last week in Saskatchewan. the thinking of Canadians is changing with regard to our colonization and our responsibility as a whole society around that. The Me Too movement and feminism, the migrant rights, all of these things have the opportunity, if we can organize it in the right way, to converge into a movement for really moving things in the right direction and taking these different incidents and really pushing forward on a different kind of an agenda. So those are the links that I'm seeing particularly. I also would just say that British Columbia particularly is got the most progressive political leadership. The New Democratic Party is the party in a minority government in British Columbia and has really complemented some of the federal programs for supports during COVID. And I would say that Canada, generally speaking, is much more inclined to look to government to support people through these kinds of issues. And there has been really significant amounts of money and programs developed during COVID. And I want to just highlight a couple. One is that the healthcare situation in long-term care, one of the most revealing things that happened during COVID was the situation of how we have come into a way of warehousing our seniors into these terrible private long-term care facilities. And one of the staffing situations of that is really precarious work for long-term care workers and particularly care aides. And the government quickly in British Columbia recognized that the staff were in precarious work and were having to work multiple long-term care homes in order to make a living. And there was as much as a $7 an hour gap between some unionized facilities, government run, and some of the private facilities. And that was forcing people to go to multiple jobs as employees. The government stepped in and closed that gap and prohibited people from working in more than one facility, so that they immediately put a stop to at least having staff members move the COVID from one long-term care facility to another and putting both seniors and other workers at risk. So that was one measure, and that was $165 million dedicated to that one measure alone in British Columbia. The second is a private sector, and that was in the grocery stores, where it's now stopped, but initially there was a $2 an hour difference, a lift on wages for grocery clerks in recognition of the fact that they were essential workers who had no choice but to be working in this situation, and also recognizing to a lesser degree, because I didn't want to talk about it so much, but the violence and the examples like being spat on and all of those are certainly happening in Canada too, and with a very strong racist undertone too, which has also come up above the surface. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Joey. I really appreciate you putting it in historical context, but I also think it's a really interesting case example of having a government that's competent versus one that's not, in terms of the COVID response and how it created such crisis levels here as opposed to in Canada. I wonder if we could take a couple minutes for any of the panelists, if you have a question for each other, to ask a question. And then if we have a couple minutes at about 11:15, we have to transition to the next part, but I can take a couple Q&As from that queue. I'll be quiet and see if anybody of you want to ask each other a question.
They're all being so polite.
Yeah, I know. I was gonna, Andrea and Melody, what was the hardest part? What, really thinking about the last year, what was the hardest part? Or maybe you can remember the hardest day of this pandemic, or a story that you heard from somebody that made you say, we gotta be working even harder to get protections for people.
For myself, I go into work on a daily basis, and on a daily basis, we have customers coming in that refuse to wear masks, that are yelling at our employees, that are very disrespectful. And I see this on a daily basis when I go into work. And when we are going into legislation and we are trying to get hazard pay for these frontline workers who have put their lives online, who have put their families in danger, because they've been exposed on a daily basis. There's only to have legislation not do anything. We have money that has been allocated for these frontline workers. Legislation continues to not do anything about it. It's not fair because these workers go to work every day, stocking the shelves, you know, helping the customers, and they're making less than someone who's sitting at home collecting unemployment benefits. That's not fair to them. And for them to be exposed or to actually come down with the virus, and legislation still just doesn't compensate them, but yet they're supposed to be the heroes. If we're heroes, then let us know, then show us by your actions, not your words. Sorry, I don't try to keep myself not getting so emotional because I know several of my coworkers firsthand who've gotten the virus.
Thanks, Melody. And Andrea, we have time for you. I think you will be our concluding remarks, and we'll transition to a really great part of it, which is the awards ceremony. Thank you.
So for myself as well, I think it was just the fact that we work with a lot of international people who come in to buy the planes as well. So a lot of our just working, workers, like I said, were elderly. So it was a little scary for the most part. And I think the biggest part right now is getting all of the staff that we need to come back to work. A lot of companies are working with like a skeleton crew right now. And it's impacting a lot of our workers. It makes the job dangerous. It makes the people have more injuries. It's a work overload. It's overwhelming. And, for a lot of the workers, and as we know, a union, as we've always, said to, one job should be enough. So making sure that there's enough staffing and that people are returning and that these companies aren't using this pandemic as an excuse for why we don't have enough people on staff and why people are having to do more than one job is a real big concern, So I think that's one of the biggest impacts right now that's been on making sure that these companies don't get away with using that and using the pandemic as an excuse on why staffing hasn't been the way it should be, Our Unite Here Local 8 did a hotline and made sure that they did a hardship fund for a lot of our workers to make sure that there's a lot of people that didn't have technology or have language skills barriers. And we worked to make sure that those people got the needs that they needed to be able to help with unemployment or rental assistance. So I think it's just really pushing the companies to make sure we bring back all workers and that workers aren't being overworked and overwhelmed right now.
Thank you. And to those of you who asked questions in Q&A, I apologize that we didn't get there. I wanted to make sure we deferred to the voices of the people on the panel to make sure that we heard their stories. So, I'm sure we can follow up later. Thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you so much. And now we will go towards the awards ceremony. Thank you all for joining us today.
Okay, Connor, is it me now?
Yes, Joe. Yeah.
Okay. Give me 1 second. Let's see. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on PA this morning for our convention. I always like to say Pacific Northwest Labor History Association because sometimes the PNLHA I forget, so I want to be sure I do it right. So we're going to start out. You guys see the conference and the schedule. So we're going to start with the Washington State Labor Council. The Washington State Labor Council, AFL-CIO, represents over 500,000 unionized workers in Washington State, roughly 1 in 5 Washingtonians. Recognizing the racism in our history as a labor movement, the affiliates of the Washington State Washington State Labor Council have repeatedly charged the organization with dedicating resources to combating white supremacy in our movement and elsewhere, and building a labor movement that supports working people across race and place. Washington State Labor Council affiliates in 2015, 2017, and 2019 passed resolutions to assist in guiding this work. Since 2015, the Washington State Labor Council has developed and ran anti-racist training designed for rank and file membership to grow collective consciousness about our role fighting white supremacy, plus the tools to support this fight. The original curriculum was created when a steering committee led by past President Jeff Johnson and Secretary Treasurer Lynn Dotson enlisted the help of Bill Fletcher Jr. and others. And we heard Bill this morning, so we know he brought a wealth, just like April said, of help to them. The workshops and modules have been adopted for use by partners across the US and are given regularly throughout Washington State and by request at the National AFL-CIO and in other states. For example, the Washington State Labor Council Racial Justice Committee hosted a virtual Juneteenth Lunch and Learn event this year that had over 5,000 viewers alone. The intent was always to provide resources and build capacity for the work of race and labor. Amazingly, in 2020, the Washington State Labor Council under President Larry Brown and Secretary Treasurer April Sims added full-time staff capacity, creating Racial and Gender Justice Director, who's currently held by Casey Pereira, and a Communications Director, who is now David Groves, that also supports the program, as well as the Standing Racial Justice Committee. The Washington State Labor Council is building upon an incredible foundation and has a plan to reach every corner of our state to both share and learn about new ways of functioning as labor unions, so that we can better illustrate and celebrate the apparent culture shift that is happening in our state as we strive to become an anti-racist movement. As Secretary Treasurer April Sims has stated, we're sacrificing the future of our movement if we refuse to meaningfully engage in the fight against systemic racism in policing, in our justice system, and in our unions. As a Black woman leader in labor, I choose to engage. I choose to be a bridge between my community and my institution, today and every day. I choose solidarity. Join me. PNLHA joins you, April, and for all the work the Washington State Labor Council continues to do for racial and gender justice, we award the Washington State Labor Council the Pacific Northwest PNLHA 2021 Making Labor History Award.
Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you so much to the PNLHA for recognizing the Washington State Labor Council and our affiliated unions for our work on racial and gender justice. This award will be prominently displayed in our office. This is so beautiful. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the work that we've been doing at the Washington State Labor Council. We started building our program in 2015 when delegates at our convention called on then President Jeff Johnson to do a deep dive into our responsibility to address systemic and institutional racism in our movement. And I just want to lift up that we prioritize equity and anti-racism work, not just because it's the right thing to do and because it feels good, but because it is strategic for our movement and we are called to do it. The Constitution of the Washington State Labor Council charges us with fighting the forces that seek to enslave the human soul. That language was written into our Constitution when we were founded in the 40s. And it is beautiful language, and it is a privilege to be called to do that work. We teach as part of our equity work that racism is a tool that has been designed to divide the working class so the wealthy elite can consolidate their wealth and their power at the very top. So the work we do to address racism in our movement builds and strengthens multiracial working class solidarity, because we know that this unity is an essential strategy for building worker power. And we've been doing this work since 2015, but I want to lift up that anti-racism work is a lot like brushing your teeth. You got to do it every day, twice a day, if you want to impress your hygienist. And so I want to take a moment to recognize President of the Washington State Labor Council, Larry Brown, for his leadership and his commitment to continuing to do the work that was started in 2015, and give a special shout out to Casey Pereira, who is our Director of Racial and Gender Justice, who is helping us take our program and actually build a campaign so that we can educate all of our union leaders and rank and file members and do the work of changing hearts and minds, so everyone has the shared analysis and the shared understanding of how racism has been used as a tool to weaken our movement. But really, I want to thank the Pacific Northwest Labor History Association for this amazing recognition and this amazing award, and share some deep appreciation for all of the work that you do. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you, April. Now, to move on to our next award. Jane Hopkins, Executive Vice President of the Service Employees International Union, better known as we know it as SEIU 1199 Northwest. While she stands together making sure, as we heard her speak so empathetically this morning, about quality care and quality careers for over 32,000 members. The members are allowed the opportunity to bargain for a better life for healthcare and behavioral health workers throughout Washington State and Western Montana. Nurse Hopkins served on Governor Jay Inslee's COVID-19 task force here in Washington State. Then the Biden-Harris Transition COVID-19 Advisory Board named Ms. Hopkins as one of 16 team members who would be ready to fight the COVID-19 crisis beginning January 20th, the first day of the 2021 Biden-Harris administration. Ms. Hopkins was an incredible fit for this role, as her background and experience encompasses being an immigrant from Sierra Leone, a registered nurse, vice president, one of the vice presidents of the Washington State Labor Council, and a member of the Washington Workforce Board. Before Ms. Hopkins' statement, I want to say before Mrs. Hopkins' statement, if you were an attendee at the 10:50 a.m. here, listening to them speak this morning on the panel, you could hear the passion and empathy in Mrs. Hopkins' voice. I'm more than honored to be the presenter of this PNLHA award to her. Ms. Hopkins said, "I'm committed to using my voice on this advisory board to speak for all essential workers." And we heard her say that today. The American people deserve an urgent, robust, and professional response to the growing public health and economic crisis caused by the coronavirus outbreak. Healthcare workers, retail workers, service workers, and essential workers of all kinds have been vital to our country during the pandemic, and their perspective must be included in our work to beat this virus. I was also fortunate enough to be in attendance when Ms. Hopkins was elected to the Washington State Labor Council. She spoke of coming together being an important perspective, which lends to the many facets of Ms. Hopkins. Imagine her rounds of work when cases in Washington reached over 165,000 infections, averaging 2,000 cases a day. We now realize the impact essential workers can have in our jobs and in our communities. Please join me, PNLHA, me being able to represent PNLHA, in congratulating our 2021 COVID-19 Difference Maker Award winner, Jane Hopkins.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, the PNLHA, the new where we say things, for this award. I have, it's beautiful. It is so beautiful. I don't know if you guys can see it. I am so honored to be awarded this amazing award. I know that I'm standing on shoulders of so many labor leaders in this state. I know that I am standing on the shoulders of healthcare workers, farm workers, essential workers that have kept this country safe in the past year. They have put their lives at risk, and I have been, hopefully, being the voice to create a safer state, a safer country. This award represents that workers can have a voice. Workers can make a difference. One of the things that we worked on, and we all knew that racial justice is going to be an essential part if we needed to succeed in combating this COVID. We knew that we need to realize that the systems that we have in place have been built on white supremacy. Some of the work that we did that I'm so proud of during the work with the governor is really saying that we are going to declare Washington State an anti-racist state. That's a huge deal for me. As being one of the only women of color in that room while we're having those conversations, and not being afraid to represent people that look like me. Whenever there is an opportunity to tell our experiences and the experiences of workers, I feel that that's my responsibility to stand up every day. Because the workers go to work every day, somebody's got to have their backs. You know, some of the things that Bill Fletcher was talking about is so important to me as a leader of SEIU, but also as a labor leader in Washington State, that we are only going to get economic justice when we have racial justice, and that we are only going to have racial justice if we're all united and we all see the value of each other, the value that we bring to the table to make change. Organizations, companies, they're sticking together, and us as the labor organizations need to stick together. We need to root out racism that our organizations have been built on. We need to dismantle that, and we need to build a new system that is united, that values everybody, every soul. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I know I am new to the labor movement in lots of ways, but I am in it for the long run. And I'm here to tell workers that we have the power to make change. So thank you very much for this award. I will treasure it. You all inspire me. Thank you.
Back to you, Connor, right?
Sure. Yeah. I just wanted to tell everybody that I put in chat a link to our final conference program, which contains Zoom links. So y'all can click on that and go to the sessions that you want. It also includes the links to our general membership meeting if you're a member. And it's also a business meeting. So feel free to click on through there. It should take you to the sessions, which will resume at about 12 p.m. Thanks again for attending. Thank you for all of our speakers. Bye.